Laudius and gentle ma'am. Imagine standing in a room where respect has gone out the window, where power speaks louder than principle, and loudness is mistaken for leadership. In that room, when a man like Donald Trump mocks a nation like Canada, calling its people mean or nasty, you have to stop and ask, what kind of strength is built on the insult of your neighbor? It's in moments like this that voices of real wisdom cut through the noise. Denzel Washington, known for his thoughtful restraint and unshakable integrity, would likely not respond with theatrics or outrage, but with clarity. He'd remind us that dignity is not reactive. That real power lies in how you carry yourself when others lose their composure. And that respect for others, for yourself, and for the truth is not negotiable even when others try to cheapen it. This isn't just about politics. It's about what kind of people we become when we allow careless words to define our worldview. When leaders set the tone, citizens follow. And when the tone is cynical, divisive, and rooted in ridicule, the soul of a nation begins to fracture, not because of policies, but because of principle. This conversation isn't about Canada. It's about who we become when we start confusing volume with virtue and criticism with courage. And that's exactly where we need to begin. When a president speaks, he does more than offer opinions. He models behavior for an entire nation. The words of a leader, especially one entrusted with representing millions on the global stage, carry symbolic and psychological weight. They frame the boundaries of what's acceptable, what's admired, and even what's imitated. So when someone like Donald Trump dismisses Canada with casual cruelty, labeling its people mean or nasty, it isn't just political theater, it's moral direction. And that direction points to something deeper, a cultural descent into contempt as a substitute for strength. The issue isn't about agreeing or disagreeing with Canadian policy. It's about the tone we normalize. It's about whether we're cultivating a culture that values truth, diplomacy, and character, or one that rewards mockery, simplification, and emotional impulsivity. Leadership sets the emotional climate of a nation. And in that climate, people begin to mirror what they see at the top. If the tone is adversarial, the citizens become suspicious. If it's insulting, they become emboldened to belittle. If it lacks reflection, so does the nation. Consider what happens when a child watches their parents solve conflict by shouting rather than listening. The lesson learned isn't just about volume. It's about power dynamics, about dominance over understanding. Nations are no different. When political power is used not to build bridges, but to throw stones, the populace absorbs that message. And soon, respect becomes weakness, diplomacy becomes naivety, and decency becomes obsolete. Denzel Washington has long been an advocate for measured strength. He's someone who doesn't equate silence with submission or kindness with fragility. He represents a different kind of leadership, one where self-control is more powerful than self-promotion, and where clarity trumps chaos. It's this contrast that makes Trump's remarks more than just provocative. They're a threat to a healthier moral compass. And so the question we're left with is not, was Trump right or wrong about Canada? That's surface level. The deeper question is, what kind of people do we become when we celebrate those who tear others down to feel strong? Because if words shape culture, then our silence, or our acceptance, shapes the future. And maybe it's time we stopped applauding the volume of our leaders and started demanding the values they claim to represent. Criticism, especially when it's aimed outward, is easy. Anyone can point a finger. Anyone can speak sharply about others, especially when they're not in the room to defend themselves. But the real test of leadership isn't how boldly someone calls out their neighbors. It's how honestly they examine themselves. When Trump criticizes a nation like Canada, not with nuance or substance, but with simplistic insults, it reveals something deeper than policy disagreement. It reveals a refusal to take responsibility. You see, accountability is the cornerstone of real leadership. It demands self-awareness. It requires a leader to ask not just, who's at fault, but what role did I play? That's a difficult question. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Because without accountability, leadership devolves into spectacle, loud attention-seeking, performative outrage designed to distract from one's own shortcomings. And in this case, Trump Trump's words seem less about Canada and more about deflection. The more he targets others, the less he has to look inward. Canada has long been one of the United States' closest allies, economically, culturally, and ideologically. Disagreements are natural, but dismissing the entire character of a nation ignores that complexity. It paints over decades of cooperation, friendship, and shared values with a single brushstroke of disdain. And that tells us more about the speaker than the subject. Because leaders who cannot acknowledge nuance often cannot tolerate introspection. They use criticism as a shield to avoid the more painful task of self-reflection. This is what separates ego from character. One seeks dominance, the other seeks understanding. One blames, the other builds. And when we elevate leaders who thrive on blaming others without taking personal responsibility, we risk creating a political culture where deflection becomes virtue and arrogance becomes policy. That's not just dangerous, it's regressive. A leader who criticizes without reflecting is not strong, he's evasive. And the longer a nation follows such examples, the further it drifts from true integrity. Because in the end, the measure of a leader is not how loud they shout at others, but how deeply they're willing to wrestle with their own flaws. True leadership begins where self-deception ends, and that's the line we all need to start drawing again. The strength of a nation isn't found in its weapons, its slogans, or the bravado of its leaders. It's found in how it treats its neighbors, especially in moments of disagreement. When Trump uses harsh language to describe Canada, he's not just expressing a personal opinion, he's redefining how one nation relates to another. He's exchanging diplomacy for drama, and in doing so, he undermines one of the most essential pillars of international stability, mutual respect. Respect is not a weakness. It's not a political strategy. It's the moral foundation on which meaningful dialogue stands. Without it, communication breaks down into suspicion, alliances become strained, and cooperation dissolves into competition. Canada, whether people realize it or not, is more than just a polite neighbor. It's a partner in trade, in defense, and in the global effort to uphold democratic values. To casually disregard that relationship with mockery isn't just rude, it's reckless. Now, this isn't to say that Canada is perfect. No nation is. But to maintain a long-term alliance, you don't need perfection. You need mutual trust. And that trust is only built when each side is treated with dignity, not derision. When a leader decides to speak carelessly about such an ally, he sends a message not just to Canada, but to the rest of the world. Loyalty is conditional and respect is negotiable. And if that becomes the rule, international partnerships start to erode from the inside. This matters because no country operates in isolation anymore. Global problems like climate change, pandemics, economic crashes require collaboration. And collaboration requires trust. But trust cannot grow in a climate of ego-driven insults. It grows in humility, in listening, in choosing words that unify rather than divide. That's the real power of diplomacy. It doesn't shout, it listens. It doesn't demand submission, it invites cooperation. When we abandon respect in the name of bluntness, we're not being courageous, we're being careless. And the cost of that carelessness isn't just a few headlines. It's a slower, more dangerous unraveling of the very fabric that holds nations together. Because in the end, how a country speaks to its allies is a reflection of how it understands itself. And if respect dies abroad, it won't be long before it disappears at home too. There's a dangerous illusion in modern political rhetoric, the idea that strength must be loud, unapologetic, and abrasive. But real strength, the kind that sustains peace and builds alliances, is quieter. It's found in restraint, in wisdom, and in the capacity to choose principle over impulse. When Trump attacks countries like Canada with inflammatory language, it doesn't project strength. It reveals insecurity disguised as dominance. And that kind of insecurity, when placed in a position of power, erodes credibility both domestically and internationally. Leadership is not about asserting dominance at every turn. It's about knowing when to speak, and just as importantly, when not to. That discipline, emotional, intellectual, and moral, is what earns respect from other nations. Because the world is watching, always. Every word from a national leader becomes a symbol of that country's values. And when those words are petty, inflammatory, or careless, they don't just stain one relationship, They reshape global perception. They chip away at the integrity that took decades to build. What makes Canada a target in this context isn't its threat, it's its example. Canada's diplomatic style, its global posture, its cultural emphasis on civility, these stand in sharp contrast to a model of politics fueled by confrontation. And when one model relies on spectacle, any alternative that chooses grace over aggression becomes inconvenient. So it gets ridiculed, not because it's weak, but because it exposes the shallowness of the opposing style. This isn't just about one man and one country. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world governed by outbursts and mockery, or one shaped by accountability and dialogue? Do we want leaders who punch down when challenged, or leaders who rise up to meet those challenges with clarity and calm? The answers to those questions determine more than foreign policy. They determine the moral compass of an era. The truth is, it takes far more strength to build than to tear down. And when a leader chooses to tear down others on the world stage, we shouldn't confuse volume for vision. Because the loudest voice in the room isn't always the wisest. Sometimes, the most powerful message is the one spoken with dignity. And in that space, real leadership begins.